In this video I'm going to show you how to quilt a little quilt with a pantograph. So it's basic edge-to-edge quilting. I've got my quilt all pinned on, but the first thing I'm going to do is baste around as far as I can, up the side and across the top. So here at my main menu I'm going to touch manual mode. I've got my machine set to basting, so I'll baste around the edge. Okay, so I can take these pins out. Alright, now I'll put my side clamps on. Okay. Alright, I've mounted this little quilt lengthwise so that I can do as much quilting as possible before having to advance. I just forgot to measure the width, so I'm just going to do that, or rather the length as it is on the machine. It's 44, okay. Now to measure this dimension I'm going to use IQ. I finish with manual. I'm going to go to utilities, measure, calibrate, and I'm going to move my machine over to the edge of my quilt. The needle's over the edge, and I'm going to reset everything so it's all zero, and then I'm just going to use the machine to measure the quilt. And this quilt is 62 inches wide. Okay, finished. So 62 by 44, this little quilt. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to my preferences and I'm going to reset my timer. So I'll reset my project time to 0 and my stitching time is already 0. So when I finish the quilt I'll come back here to see how long I've spent on it. The project time will count up the whole time that IQ is turned on, so it's counting when I'm advancing the quilt and thinking. The stitching time obviously is just the stitching. Finished. Okay, so I think we're ready to start. Here I am back at the main menu. Design Sew Quilt. I want to start something new. It's going to be a pantograph, and I'm going to enter the rectangle manually. My width is 62 of the actual quilt, so I'm going to set it up as 63. I can always cut bits off, it's not so easy to add bits, and this will give me a little leeway if the quilt isn't perfectly straight. And the height I said was 44, so let's make that 45. Enter. Continue. There's my whole quilt, and it's showing me that my needle's at the top left. Well, it isn't. It's right in the middle of the quilt. So before I exit this page, I'm going to move my machine up to the top left of this quilt. And because I made it the width slightly wider than the quilt, I'm going to make the needle about 1/4 inch off this edge. Just checking my dimensions and hit finished. Okay, I'll move back here now because now I'm going to choose my design. And I'm just going to do a simple meandering on this quilt, and I think I have a meandering meanders catalogue. Yes, I do. Here are all my meanders. Well, some are mine and some are not. So I think we'll use this one, meander edge to edge. So it says select a catalogue, which is what I did, and touch the pattern you want to use on the odd rows. So that one, continue. Select a catalogue and touch the pattern you want to use on the even rows. I'm going to use the same design. Continue. And there IQ has put the design on my quilt. Now it usually defaults to 12 inches. That's actually too much for my machine to stitch. I could stitch a row of 12 inches at the beginning, but not when I got to the end, especially of a big quilt. So I'm going to reduce the row height to, let's make it 10.5. Okay. Now looking closely, and I'm going to turn the zoom on and zoom in, and I'm going to zoom in right here to where 2 rows meet. I think those are too close together, so I'm going to increase the gap between the rows, and I'll increase it by touching this button. You see the gap getting larger. Oh, let me pan over here a bit. These lines here are touching. I don't quite like that, but so maybe I won't use this meander because there's nothing I can do about this. So I'm going to, because I've decided not to use this design, I'm simply going to touch the back button. Are you sure you want to exit? Yes. And it's taken me back to my patterns. So let's go down to the meandering again. And I'll get one of these. That one for my odd rows, that one for my even rows. Okay, this time I need to close up the gap. So I'll close up the gap. That's better. And I'll also change my row height to 10. The important number here is not so much row height as pattern height. Pattern height says it's 11.765, which I know is too much for my machine. That number can never be bigger than the throat, the quilting space of your machine. I'm going to make that even less, so I'm just simply going to tap, tap, tap until it gets down to about there. I'm looking at the design now too. Okay, I quite like that. One last check, because this is the whole quilt, the design looks pretty small, so I'm going to turn zoom on, going to touch true size, then touch the image. That's the actual size it's going to stitch out at. Let's pan around a bit. That looks pretty good. Let's go zoom full so we see the whole thing again. Let's take the row height down a little bit more, so that quilting's a little bit closer together. Okay, I'm going to go to true size again, touch the image. That's a bit better. I like that a bit better. Zoom full. So that's what I'm going to use. Okay, so I'm all done here, so I'm going to touch finished. It's updating. Now on this page it says clipping confirmation. It wants to know what it's going to do when it hits the edge of the quilt. The pattern is cut off. Let's zoom in to this edge here. You can see where the pattern is cut off by the edge of the quilt. Right now the transition type is continuous, so when the machine gets to here it'll just stitch a straight line across, around, across, and so on. I can change that transition if I don't want it to stitch continuously. My other choices are, and if I touch the plus it will change the choice, jump stitch, which means when it's stitched this, IQ will just drag the threads over to here and then start stitching again. Jump stitches are always shown with the green line. My third option is tie off, which means when the machine gets to here, it'll stop, wait for me to cut the threads before it carries on. I don't want that, so I'm going to hit the plus again to get back to continuous. That's what I want. It'll be either right at the edge of the quilt or off the edge of the quilt, so continuous is just fine. So accept. Do you want to commit the transitions? You'll not be able to change it later? Yes. Okay, and you can see that I can't see the whole quilt here. That's because I have my zoom lock on, so it did not automatically show me the whole quilt. It kept the magnification from the previous page. So there's my whole quilt. Now at this point I'm going to save this quilt. So here's save quilt. Save the quilt. The quilt name, let's clear out that and call it Safari. Enter. And I will keep it in my my working catalogue. Working. Select. Okay, now I'm ready to sew. So I'm looking for the button that says Sew Quilt, and here it is, Sew Quilt. You already have a work in progress. Do you want to replace it? Yes, I do. Whatever it was, I don't want that anymore. It says unsaved in progress was moved to the recycle bin. So at the end of this quilt I can go back and look at the recycle bin and see if I want to save that quilt. I can't remember what it is right now. Continue. Okay, I'm going to sequence this whole quilt and stitch each row in sequence, so it's one whole quilt. So my message says select the first pattern to quilt, and it is this. Whoa! If I zoom in, you can see it's not necessarily that one. Pan. Can you see I selected this green, but there's a little bit of blue here, which is telling me there's a little tiny bit of another row up there. So I'm going to go zoom full again, zoom off, select the first pattern to quilt. I'm going to touch that first row. I've got an S1 here and an E1 here. Start one, end one. That's good. Continue. Select the next pattern to quilt. This one. S2, E2. Continue. Now it says, how do you want to connect this pattern? It's talking about the rows. After it's stitched that first row, it needs to come back over here to start the second row, and it wants to know what it's going to do at that point. We've got three choices: continuous sewing, stop to cut threads, automatic jump stitch. I'm going to choose stop to cut threads. Select the next pattern to quilt. This is row number 3. Continue, stop to cut threads. Continue, stop to cut threads. Select the next pattern to quilt. This one. Continue, stop to cut threads. Select the next pattern to quilt. This one. Continue, stop to cut threads. Select the next pattern to quilt. This one. Continue, stop to cut threads. And now it says sequencing complete. There are no more patterns to sequence, so I'm done. So now we can, what's to do next? Sew quilt. Touch sew quilt. And the machine is moving to the start of that first row. Does one stitch, so I can now pull up the bobbin thread. And the thread is so short that it didn't catch the bobbin thread, so I will go back, pull it up myself using the single stitch button. Okay. Alright, the message says please set the regulated stitch length or constant speed on the quilting machine. I prefer to use constant speed, so I'm moving my dial over to the constant speed side. Hit continue. I'm looking at the speed here that IQ is going to move the machine. That's a pretty decent speed. If I go up here, it's telling me remaining time is 30 minutes. All those rows are going to take 30 minutes to stitch. and the length of all the rows, if they were all just a straight line, 80.1 yards. If you know how much thread is on a bobbin and you're doing a really complicated quilt, you can, where I sequence many rows, you can just sequence one complete row, then come to this Sew Quilt page and it will show you how long that initial row is, and whether you can do it with one bobbin. It'll also tell you how long it's going to stitch out that one row, so you have some idea of whether you can do some other task whilst IQ is stitching. Okay, I'm ready to go. Speeds are all set. I'm going to hit start. I sped up my needle a bit because the stitches were a little bit too long for my taste. I'm just adjusting the speed on the machine to change the stitch on it. This is just a little partial row at the top of the quilt. Now it's ended way off the edge here because of course I told it this quilt was bigger than it really is. It's finished that first row and I told it to stop so I could cut the threads, which is why it beeped, so I can cut the threads. Now, I don't think I have to advance to stitch this next row, but I'm going to use my machine to see if that's true. So I'm bringing my machine forward and watching for where the shade of green changes. It may not be clear on the video, but this first row is a lighter shade of green to this second row. And I'm moving the machine along to the lowest point of the light green, and I can easily do that without advancing my quilt. So I'm just going to help the machine a little and move it over to the left hand side again. And tell it to start. Doesn't matter, I don't have to put the needle over the start point. IQ will move to the start point. It's one stitch and we'll go. I'm not worrying that I'm stitching off the edge of the quilt at this point. For the next row I'll show you how to clip off part of it. So we'll set this going and then we'll come back when this row is completed. Okay, there we are at the end of the second row. Now this time you can see how much it's stitched off the edge. I'm going to stop it doing that for the next row. See how it flipped the edge of the quilt as it came back on, even though I basted. That doesn't really bother me because it's going to be under the binding. So it says cut the threads and touch start. Well, I'm going to cut the threads all right, but I'm not going to touch start because I'm going to advance the quilt. So I'll release my clamps and I'll advance the quilt. Quilt straight. I run a line of pins along here at this edge just to keep a little taut, keep the quilt taut, because it's not wound onto the bar down here at the front. Okay, now I want to baste down each side. So I need to go to manual mode. I've moved the quilt. I'm not going to touch start on this screen. I'm going to touch realign. And now here's the button that says manual mode, so I can baste. So I'm hitting manual mode. It's lifting the drive wheels, and then I can baste down the side. And this time I'm using just my single stitch button to baste down the side. Put my clumps back on. Okay, check the height of my quilt. It's a little bit high. Okay. So I've finished basting, so I'm going to hit finished on this manual mode page. Alright, the message says touch a reference point on the screen. I can't see enough of the quilt, so I am going to go zoom on, zoom full, so I can see the whole quilt. Now you can see the red are the rows I've already stitched, and the green ones are yet to be stitched. And this is where my needle is. Now, it's showing it over a red row there, but if you look at my quilt, there's no stitching here. That's because I've advanced the quilt, but I haven't told IQ I've done that yet. So it still thinks that last bit of stitching is down here. Okay, so I finished, I've got zoom full. I like to realign to a point somewhere in the center of the quilt, because that has not moved as much as the edges. The edges will draw in slightly, whereas the center is most stable. So I'm going to move my machine to the center of this quilt. Now if I look up here on my screen, I can see this is where my needle is. Well, this is where IQ thinks the needle is. The quilt, of course, is advanced. I'm just going to concern myself with this vertical line. Imagine there's a line going right through the needle here. That's what that green line is, that green vertical line on the screen. So I am going to zoom in to that green vertical line right there, right where that red, the red row of last stitching is. Okay, I'm going to turn zoom off now. My reference point is going to be right here, where that red line crosses my green vertical line, and I am going to move my machine up to where the needle is over the stitching. It's now over that position on my quilt. Okay? Now you can't see the horizontal line truly showing my needle because of course IQ still doesn't know I've moved the quilt. All I'm concerned with is that the needle is crossing that stitching line on my quilt there, that's on my screen. Now as soon as I hit continue, very, very briefly you will see the horizontal needle crosshair jump to that position. It'll be very quick. So watch carefully as when I touch continue. And hit OK. Okay, IQ has moved to the edge of the quilt. I've got my message about please set the regulated stitch length, so I can hit continue there. It's off the edge of the quilt here. It's only a little way off the edge, so I'll start it stitching there, but I'm remembering that it's stitched way off the other side of the quilt. So before I do any stitching, I'm going to clip that edge. And to do that, I'm going to touch this button which says adjust. And I'm looking here that says adjust mode tweak. I don't want tweak, I want clip. So I'm going to touch that button and it's changed to clip. Right? So now I'm going to move over to the other side of the quilt. I am going to put my needle over the edge of that quilt. Let me come this side. Right. Adjust mode clip. It says touch a dashed line and drag it to the desired position. I'm touching the right hand dashed line and it turned red. And because my needle is over the edge of the quilt, I'm not going to drag the dashed line, I'm just going to touch this button that says snap to needle. And it has clipped off that extra, the extra amount of design. Now if I also want to clip the left hand edge, before I move the machine, I need to touch the left hand edge dashed line. And then I'll move my machine over to the left hand edge. And the same thing, I'll do snap to needle and it'll trim that side too. So now I'm all done. I can touch continue. And now I'm ready to start. Now it says move the needle to the restart location and touch OK. Well, where is that restart location? Well, there it is. There's a little S3. I'm on row 3. S is the start. Now you'll notice some of this is red. IQ seems to think it's stitched that already. I know it hasn't. So I'm moving my needle to the start point there. Hit OK. Does the one stitch so I can bring up the bobbin thread, and then we'll hit start. Okay, that's the third row finished, and I clipped that edge so it didn't stitch so far off the quilt as it did for the previous row. So it says cut the threads to touch start. No, I don't want to do that because I'm going to advance my quilt. So I am going to touch realign. I will cut my threads, however, with my machine, and I will advance my quilt. Smooth out my little quilt top. Now I'm going to baste down the sides. So here's my button that will put me into manual mode so I can baste. Nice, the other side. A bit of horrible tension right there that I will fix later. This little quilt is just going to a charity, so I'm not too concerned about that. Okay, I've basted down the sides, so I'm finished basting, so I will touch finished. The message says touch a reference point on the screen. I can only see a tiny bit of the quilt, so I'm going to go zoom on, zoom full. There's my quilt. I'm over the center here, which is where I want to be. I'm looking at that vertical green crosshair. I'm going to put my needle over the stitching first this time. That's where that stitching is. Remember, IQ doesn't know I've moved the quilt yet, so it's putting the horizontal crosshair for the needle way up there. This is where my needle actually is. I'm going to zoom in to this point here, where that vertical line crosses that red stitched line. That's actually where my needle is. I've got to turn the zoom off and now touch the reference point on the screen, and I'm touching right there. Okay? Now when I hit continue, IQ is going to say move the needle to the location of the reference point and touch OK. Well, my needle's already there, so I don't need to move it. When I hit OK, IQ will recognize that I've advanced the quilt. You'll see the horizontal crosshair jump to that position, and then IQ will start to move to the start point of the next row. Okay? Okay, and I clipped this edge previously, and it's kept the clip there, and it's taken its one stitch right at the edge of the quilt, which is good. My message says please set the regulated stitch length. I'm going to hit continue there. Now I'm just going to check that the other side will still stitch right to the edge. So I'm just going to move my machine over to the other side, put my needle over the edge of the quilt, and I'm looking at the image there, and that's just fine. I don't need to clip it again. If you look at the screen, you can see my needle's over the edge, and that's exactly where the pattern ends. So I don't need to clip that edge again, so I don't need to touch that adjust button. I'm going to move the machine back over to the left hand edge of the quilt now, so that it can start stitching. Start of this row right there. I see S4. I will take a single stitch because IQ's already done that. Won't do it again. I'll hold the threads tight this time. Hit start. The last row on this quilt, and if you look down here, yikes, I haven't got much wiggle room here. The backing, this is where the backing is pinned to the leader, so I really got to make sure this does not stitch off the edge at the bottom of this quilt. So I've already realigned. I'm going to bring my needle down to that edge, and I'm looking up here now at my screen. Let me come a little bit closer to the camera. Looking up here at my screen, this is where my needle is. See how much more design there is below my needle? I can't possibly stitch that because I'll be stitching onto my leader. So I need to clip that bottom edge of my quilt. So I'm going to touch adjust. I'm looking here, it says adjust mode clip. That's what I want. Now I'm going to turn the zoom on, and I'm going to go to zoom full, and I'm going to touch the dash, oh, I'm going to turn zoom off first. I'm going to touch the dashed line at the bottom, and I'm going to touch snap to needle, and it's cut off all that excess design, so it should not stitch onto my leaders now. Now I'm just going to move along my quilt here. I think it's pretty straight at the bottom, there aren't any horrible wiggles, so I think we're going to be okay. So I'm done with my clipping, so I'm going to hit continue. It says move the needle to the restart location and touch OK. So I'm coming back over here looking for my start, and I'm following the blue line which will take me to my start point. That blue line is coming from the end of the previous row over to the start of the last row. That's how I know that that is my start point. It also says S6, start 6. So I'm going to touch OK. IQ does the one stitch. So I can bring up the bobbin thread, and then we're all set. And I will watch this last row just to make sure my clipping was correct all the way across. That was good, so I know it's going to go all the way across correctly. There's a little part here not stitched because that will be a very small part of another row knot. So I'll pause it at this point. So that's how to stitch a whole quilt with a pantograph, sequencing all the rows.